Hello and welcome to the France 24 debate. If you're just joining us, I'm Annette Young, filling in for François Picard. And it's been seen as a major diplomatic win for the French President Emmanuel Macron. Hosting a meeting in Paris between Libya's two main rival leaders, the French leader was seen to be seeking to be a peacemaker for a country that's been racked with sectarian violence in the last 6 years. As a result, Fayez al-Sarraj, the Prime Minister of the UN-backed unity government, and General Khalifa Haftar, the Egyptian-backed commander of Libya's self-styled national army, have agreed to a conditional ceasefire. It won't apply, however, to fighting Islamist militants. Bell Lupton takes a look back at 6 years of instability and conflict in the country.
Jubilance across a nation as 42 years under Muammar Gaddafi comes to an end. The authoritarian Libyan president meeting a grisly end in a tunnel, trying to escape his hometown of Sirte. In 2014, a new Libya holds parliamentary elections, but violence results in low turnout. Gunmen storm the parliament in Tripoli, and Libya is left without a central government. Enter General Khalifa Haftar, a former Gaddafi loyalist. He begins an offensive against what he says are Islamist militias. His armed group, the Libyan National Army, captures several key cities, including Benghazi in the northeast. In July, Tripoli's international airport becomes a battleground between Haftar and his coalition and the newly formed Libya Dawn coalition, which is led by fighters from the northwestern city of Misrata. This conflict establishes two rival governments, the General National Congress in Tripoli and the House of Representatives in Tobruk. The Tobruk-based government was backed by Haftar. It was led by a Prime Minister, Abdullah al-Thani, and recognised by the UN, US, EU, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, even though the Libyan Supreme Court ruled it to be illegal and unconstitutional in November 2014. The Tripoli-based government was an unelected reincarnation of the original GNC, whose term had expired in August 2014. Its leader was a president, Nouri Abu Samain, and it was dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood's Justice and Construction Party. December 2015, Libya's two rival factions sign a UN-backed deal to form a unity government, led by Fayez al-Sarraj. But a change of heart in some of the players throws the new government into disarray. The Islamic State group takes advantage of the chaos in Libya to advance into Sirte. The following year, the US begins an air campaign against IS at the request of Libya's UN-backed government in Tripoli.
And here to talk to me about today's announcements are Rumiana Ugarczynska, who is here with me in the studio. She's a journalist and author of the book For the Skin of Gaddafi. In London, Juma El Gamati, a member of the Libyan Political Dialogue Group. In Tobruk in Libya, Mohammed El-Jar, a fellow at the Atlantic Council, and also joining us by satellite from London, Mattia Toaldo, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to thank all four of you for giving us your time. Let me start with you, Rumiana. This is a country which is veering on and off in terms of instability and heading towards the likelihood of civil war since the ouster of Gaddafi 6 years ago. Given what's happened today, do you think the willpower is there in order to make progress, in order to move towards some form of stability?
Yes, I think that what happened in Paris today is really very important. And it's important because it's the first time it's a real dialogue. If you want to have a dialogue, you have to talk to the two parts of this dialogue. It wasn't really the case from the beginning of the efforts of United Nations to find a solution in this political crisis and also in the chaos of Libya. So what started today is a real dialogue. It will not please everybody. It will be very difficult to implement because there is a lot of details which are not mentioned in this final statement delivered today as the way to do it, as what will be done if the very important city of Misrata disagree, if some militia from Tripoli disagree, if some groups from the south also disagree, because all of them, they have their own problems and sometimes their own agenda. But for sure, from now on, there is a dialogue, and this dialogue with the support of a very strong country, which is France. And France, I think, had the better position to do it.
Let me at this point bring in Mohammed Al-Jar from Tobruk in Libya. The interesting thing about this agreement is it doesn't include fighting Islamist militants. Could that itself become its downfall?
It is not just the militant Islamists that are not included. Actually, there are many other groups that have not been included in this meeting, including powerful armed groups from the city of Misrata, but also some armed groups or political groups from Misrata and from Tripoli. I slightly disagree with your guest at the studio. I don't think that there has been much substance in the statement, the joint statement that was issued today. Yes, the meeting is important. It's always important to get two key Libyan stakeholders at the table, but there was not any substance, and the only two announcements that were made is a ceasefire, but in reality Prime Minister al-Sarraj and Haftar are not fighting each other on the ground, so there was no need for a ceasefire in the first place. The second point is that they announced elections, and I think both Haftar and Prime Minister al-Sarraj both have said in the past that they support the idea of elections. So I think if there is to be any substance and any success for this meeting, it has to be followed by steps that would ensure it widens the participation base for such dialogue. However, I guess the key point and the important point here was the presence of the new UN envoy to Libya, Hassan at the table, so that France's efforts are in support of the UN and the international efforts in Libya, and they are not just part of the rival relationship between Rome and Paris when it comes to the Libya file.
At this point, let me now swing the attention across to Juma in London. I mean, despite what Mohammed just said, it's still very much the first step in a country that's so politically fractured and awash in militias.
I think it's very important not to raise expectations very high about the meeting today. I think the meeting today is definitely a victory, a PR victory for the new French president, Monsieur Macron. But to project it as a deal breaker or as the breakthrough that the Libyans and the world has been waiting for in Libya, I think that is not realistic at all for various reasons. And also I disagree with your lady guest at the studio that this is the start of the genuine dialogue. Actually, a dialogue sponsored by the UN and many countries, including France, started in Libya in September 2014, sponsored by the UN, and went on for almost a year and a half and produced the Skhirat-Morocco agreement, which we signed in December 2015, a year and a half ago. And if it wasn't for that dialogue and that agreement, Sarraj would not be sitting today with Haftar. So Sarraj is an outcome of that real dialogue, which was much more inclusive than just two sides of the conflict. There are many parties to the Libyan conflict, and the two personalities we saw today are only two of them. There are other crucial players and important sides which have to be included, and I think going back to the UN-sponsored dialogue and the agreement, the LPA, the Libyan political agreement, as a framework is very important, because that includes the other crucial parties. parties. Another important point or question to raise here today is, does the statement today mean that now General Haftar recognizes the Libyan political agreement signed in Skhirat in Morocco, and he accepts it? If that is the case, I think that is progress, and I hope now Haftar will go ahead and allow the H2R, the parliament in Tobruk, which he controls and dominates, allow them to actually ratify it.
Okay,
also,
at this point, let me just bring in Mattia Toalado from London. This just gives you a sense, given all these different perspectives we've just been listening to in the last few minutes, of just how difficult this task is. Certainly, it was a tough call for a young and inexperienced French president to do what he did. Isn't that itself a victory of a sorts, rather?
Oh yes, of course. In terms of visibility, today's summit is a great victory for Macron. But I hope he's aware that from today on, he owns the political process in Libya, which basically restarts today and restarts with a recognition of the legitimacy of General Haftar, which was not given for granted at the time in which the UN-backed agreement, of which Juma was talking about, was signed almost 2 years ago. So there is a new strong actor on the field. It has been recognized for the first time in a big Western capital. France has a leading role. Now the ball is in the court of the UN envoy, who has strong connections to France, as we know. And it's his task to expand the dialogue. I agree with all the people who have spoken before that 2 people is not enough. And probably Salameh, with the help of France, will need to involve all those other groups in Tripoli, in Misrata, in the south of Libya, who have not been invited today to the meeting.
Rumiana, the reality is both Sarraj and Haftar, who of course is backed by Egypt, the UAE and Russia, met in Abu Dhabi in May. Now that meeting was announced with great celebration, but nothing came out of that particular event. What is different about today?
The difference is first that it's happening in France, and the influence of France for sure is not the same. And the big difference is also that it was prepared, and it was prepared by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who previously met all the other countries involved in different negotiation or helping to solve the Libyan imbroglio, and all of them had talks with him. And previously to that meeting, France made sure that everybody knows what they will do, and that for the first time, the so-called international community will have one agenda and will stop disagreement. Because, yes, there is a lot of problems inside Libya, but for sure, the fact that the agenda of Algeria was not totally the same that this of Egypt or this of Moscow, of Washington, it was a big problem to find how to solve that. So stopping this disjoint diplomacy for the first time, I think that really it makes the big difference today.
Juma El-Gamati, given what Rumiana just said and what we just heard there earlier, that basically France now owns this. You know, the buck, or the euro rather, stops with France. As I said earlier, well, that's a big responsibility on the part of an inexperienced president, is it not?
Well, we cannot say that France now owns the Libya political problems or issue unless Monsieur Macron got a green light recently from President Trump of the United States that France can actually go ahead now and takes the lead, because we still think that everybody believes that the really heavyweight around the world is the United States. The United States have been heavily involved with the Libyan political process and the debates and the dialogue and the agreement, and even in fighting ISIS in Sirte, for example, with all the hundreds of airstrikes. So if the United States, under a new president, has decided to take a few steps back and allow a European country like France to take the lead, then maybe yes, France does have that role with the blessing of America. Otherwise, we cannot say that France owns it, because there are also other important actors, regional and European. Egypt, the Emiratis, Algeria, Italy, and the United Kingdom are all important actors who have been heavily involved.
El-Gamati, we're going to have to leave it there because at this point we've run out of time for the first part. Do stay with us, viewers, for the second part of the France 24 debate coming up shortly. And welcome back to the second part of the France 24 debate. I'm Annette Young, filling in for François Picard. And it's been seen as a major diplomatic coup for the French President, Emmanuel Macron, hosting a meeting in Paris today between Libya's two main rival leaders. The French leader is seeking to be a peacemaker for a country that's been racked with sectarian violence in the last 6 years. As a result, Fayez al-Sarraj, the Prime Minister of the UN-backed unity government, and General Khalifa Haftar, the Egyptian-backed commander of Libya's self-styled national army, effectively signed off on a conditional ceasefire. However, will such an agreement hold, especially given that questions are being raised over General Haftar, whose forces have been accused of human rights abuses, while Sarraj has been struggling to gain support? Nicholas Rushworth takes a closer look at these two men.
He has emerged as Libya's military strongman. General Khalifa Haftar earlier this month announced the liberation of Benghazi in eastern Libya, which had been overrun by jihadists for 3 years.
The city of Benghazi has been freed from terrorism. The liberation is total.
He is the commander of the self-styled Libyan National Army. He served under the late dictator Muammar Gaddafi and was part of the coup that brought him down in 2011. His forces have gained ground in the east of the country with the backing of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. France sees him as the main bulwark against the jihadist threat in Libya and has provided intelligence support to him. However, Haftar backs a government in the east and does not recognize the UN-backed government in the capital, Tripoli, led by Fayez al-Sarraj. Sarraj this month laid out a new political roadmap for the country, including the scheduling of presidential and parliamentary elections in March next year. Analysts say that he lacks real consolidated support within Libya. His government of national accord has been struggling to assert its authority since it began work in Tripoli in March last year. The two men last met in May in Abu Dhabi with no result.
Now, here to discuss with me today's announcement, Rumiana Ugadachinska, who's here with me in the studio. She's a journalist and author of the book For the Skin of Gaddafi. In London, Juma El-Gamati, the member of the Libyan Political Dialogue Group. In Tobruk, Libya, Mohammed El-Jar, a fellow at the Atlantic Council, and also joining us by satellite from London, Mattia Toaldo, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks again to all of you for making yourselves available. Let me start with you, Rumiana. Why has Emmanuel Macron made Libya such a priority?
It's very important for France, because you know that France is involved in Mali and in all the area of Sahel. So there is a military operation there for years, which name is BARNEY. And this problem of the Sahel and the instability of this area is a main issue for France. They cannot stay the only one involved to fight against terrorist groups in this area. And for them, the chaos of Libya generate much more problems. And it was urgent, really urgent for France to find a way to fix this problem and to go out of the chaos of Libya. So that was really the first point, and the fact that Libya started to be a real terrorist hub of the region, because you have Islamic State, you have Al-Qaeda-linked groups, but also a lot of other Islamist little groups which are switching from one to other, and this is a real dangerous situation.
Let me bring in Mohammed from Tobruk in Libya. Do you think the French president has bitten off more than he can chew?
I think it's too early to say. However, I think it's important that France plays a role in trying to find a solution to the current crisis, because of the role that France played in 2011 in toppling the Gaddafi regime. Back then, the French fighters were the first to conduct airstrikes against the Gaddafi regime under the UN Council resolution, or the pretext of the UN Council resolution, responsibility to protect. But I think it would be very simplistic to assume that Prime Minister Sarraj and Haftar can actually, by coming together, they can actually solve the problem in Libya. It is a very pragmatic approach, and it's an approach that brings the international legitimacy, which is on the side of Prime Minister Sarraj, but also brings the military legitimacy, the actual force on the ground, and that's in favor of Khalifa Haftar. But if Paris fails to bring in other key actors, including from the city of Misrata and some key actors in Tripoli, I think Macron will face difficulty in finding a sustainable solution to the crisis in Libya. So I think pragmatism is important in this case, but it is also important to think about who else to bring at the table and make sure that the solution to the crisis or the efforts are actually sustainable.
Juma, this initiative is also very much aimed at facilitating the work of UN Special Negotiator Hassan, who's highly regarded here in Paris. But he's certainly going to have his work cut out for him, as we just heard there from Mohammed.
Absolutely. I think it's a welcome step to bring in Hassan Salameh, a Lebanese, an Arab who understands Libya and the region probably better, understands all the intricacies and the historical, the cultural, the political dimensions. And he's a well-respected academic and a political scientist. So absolutely, I think it's a welcome step. However, Hassan Salameh would have been told by his previous predecessor, by the way, he's the sixth one in 6 years by the UN as an envoy. He would have been told that it's very, very important and vital to bring in all the key actors. Otherwise you can never have a true lasting peace in Libya, because if you exclude, if marginalize any key actors, then they will be all willing and ready to spoil any agreement. And that's what has been happening in the last two years, is that some people chose to actually make obstacles in the way of implementing the political agreement that we signed in Skhirat in December 2015. So yes, hopefully Hassan Salameh would have learned from the experience of the last year and a half, and would have listened to many parties, not just Sarraj and Haftar, and would have realized that there are amendments, key amendments needed to the agreement after 1.5 years of trying to implementing it on the ground. However, it's very interesting that the communique today does not talk about any amendments, but it talks about activating the agreement as if no amendments are required. This is a crucial weakness, because we know that a key actor like Aguila Saleh, the head of parliament based on Tobruk, insists on amendments. And not only that, he insists that the current PC, Presidential Council members, including Sarraj, has to be totally removed and replaced by new faces, whereas Sarraj and Haftar talk about just activating it as if Sarraj and his group, his fellows in the PC, will continue until there is new elections. There is another problem also. When they call for elections, On what basis? What is the constitutional basis for calling elections? Because the political agreement stipulates that we are now in the final transitional period, which is the third period, and that we will wait until we have a permanent constitution, where we have a constitution drafting committee working, and after a permanent constitution that are offered to a referendum by the Libyan people, if it's approved, then we move to elections for what's called permanent status. Whereas today's communique talk about quick elections for another transitional period, the fourth one. But who's going to legislate for that? It has to be Parliament. That means
let me just at this point, because you've got a long list of what needs to be done, let me now go to Matthias, because not only obviously is there a lot of issues that need to be dealt with in the forthcoming talks, but Paris has equally upset the Italians, who have reportedly expressed their annoyance at the French leader for calling a meeting on a subject that they themselves tend to see as very much under their sphere of influence.
Yeah, there were a lot of inflated expectations in Rome, just because sometimes the US president, first Obama and then Trump, tells you that Libya is your file. That doesn't mean it's your file. Of course, France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so it's a bigger diplomatic power. And it's normal that France gets back in dealing with Libya. But as I said, dealing again with Libya means owning the problem and owning the difficulties of implementing a peace plan. So the Italians will need to play ball with the process that started today. And so we'll have to do the Algerians and the Tunisians, and the relationship that France has with the Emirates and Egypt, which was so important in organizing today's meeting, will also be strained by the implementation. There are lots of ambiguities that will need to be dealt with. For instance, one of the goals is to create a united army. Well, they have tried to do this for 5 years. It will take a lot of political compromise. It will take a lot of tugs of war. So it will be a difficult task.
Just coming back to the whole issue in regards to refugees, Rumiani, I mean, most of them have been landing on Italy's shores. So as a result, they're quite legitimately right and somewhat being put out that they haven't been included really as part of this process.
I don't think so, because this migrant crisis is part of the Libyan problem, and we cannot talk about without mention that all these migrants are coming from the part of Libya which is supposed to be under the control of the GNA, which is held by all the international community and the United Nations. They are all concentrated there, and we know very well about that. So it means that it's not enough to have support for a government. It means that you need more. You need a state. You need really tools to secure the borders, which is not the case now. So, in fact, in this final statement, there is talks about unifying army, about borders, about ceasefire, even if there is not civil war in Libya. That's for true. That's for sure. But all these questions are very closely linked to the problem of the migrants. And really, if it was not possible until now, even supporting the GNA and al-Sarraj with help, with training for coast guards, with a lot of money also, if it was not possible to solve this migrant crisis, it's because the other points were not included in the whole solution. And that's why it was important to have a political willing to solve all the other questions.
I now want to talk to both Mohammed and Juma, both of you representing various sectors of Libyan society. Now, you've outlined there your criticisms about what was or was not included in today's announcement. Let me start with you, Mohammed. What, in your opinion, needs to be immediately addressed?
I think one of the most important issues that needs to be addressed is the legitimacy issue in Libya. Currently, Libya does not have a single representative government that includes the majority or as many stakeholders to make it work as possible. That is number one. And then number two, it's also important to address the issue of participation in governance in Libya, so that the key actors and the population as well feels they are part of a solution, or they are part of electing a government that represents them both inside Libya but also internationally. And on a longer term, I think one of the main obstacles to Libya's transition over the last 6 years has been the weapons that are scattered throughout the country, but also the fact that we have so many armed groups operating under different umbrellas with different interests and agendas and so on. So from a longer perspective, or possibly immediate and also longer perspective, a DDR process by which we can have weapons collected, disarming militias, and making sure that we have a unified chain of command for the armed forces in Libya. But for any government in the future also, and for a political agreement to be sustainable, you would have obviously to deal with all the quick wins, i.e. services, delivering services when it comes to electricity, the cash crisis that we are facing in Libya, the economy, etc. All of these are important issues, and these are issues that any government or any agreement or any international effort has to take into account so that a solution can actually be sustainable.
Juma, let me just talk about that, and that is what life is like for the average Libyan. I mean, you've got rampant inflation, you've got power outages. The fact that despite the country having oil reserves, money is not being fed back into the economy but is ending up in the black market. From where you're standing, what needs to be done as soon as practically possible to improve the quality of life for people living in the country?
You're absolutely right. The real victims of the conflict of Libya are the ordinary citizens of Libya, who are suffering terribly from security problems and socio-economic problems. And unfortunately, many of the political actors are playing games with the Libyan people and the Libyan issue, and just following their own narrow, selfish agendas on all sides, not just one side or the other. So as a result of that, I think what happened today in France can only be a good thing if it is seen as a welcome, fresh injection of vigor, impetus, and political will to resolve their issues in Libya. And what really needs to be done in Libya is to help Libyans to craft and strike a social contract, a new constitution that allows Libyans a fair, just share of power and wealth, that all Libyan sides, all Libyan segments and aspects of Libyan society feel that they own or they are part of this new social contract and a new constitution, and move into permanent status and the process of institution building and state building. One big obstacle to that is the negative, detrimental interference by regional Arab, especially Arab players, unfortunately, who keep fueling the conflict and pouring oil on the fire. And another obstacle is that some people are not recognizing that what we need in Libya is a state, institution state, a civilian state led by directly elected civilian politicians, where the military people, the top military people, should be under the command of those elected civilian leaders. That's one of the issues that some of actors like Haftar need to recognize and state clearly that he subscribes to that. I think if we have these major issues resolved, then I think we will move quickly, and Libya is doable. It can be resolved quickly. We need not just France, we need all the key players to be involved and to give it the political will and the vigor that it needs. On that basis, as I said, what happened in France today is welcome.
Juma, let me at this point just bring in Mattia and also Rumiana in terms of what you've just said. Mattia, I mean, if you look at Libya, I mean, the reality is when the state is weak or not present at all, the tribes are strong. And that is what has happened with this country, that effectively it's just evolved into mini communities of warring tribes. Do you think it's possible to bring what is a highly divided and polarised society together?
Oh, yes. There is this view that Libya is all about tribes. This is true for big parts of Libya, but it's not true about the big cities where tribal allegiances are much weaker. And actually 2/3 of the population lives in the 3 biggest cities. And Libyans have already demonstrated, especially in Western Libya, that they're capable of connecting those communities, at least for local ceasefires and reconciliation agreements. There have been similar agreements in the south of Libya which have worked. So it's not impossible to pacify Libya, but it's more difficult than someone might think. Yes, it's easier than Yemen, it's easier than Syria, but it's still difficult.
Rumiana, what would you say to that?
I would say that tribes are not a problem. Tribes can help for the solution. When we say that there is difference from the cities and the other parts of Libya, you know, I have been so many times in Libya. I spent months in Libya last year, and I met a lot of people from different tribes. So tribes are not a problem because tribes are helping to build the real social network to connect the Libyans and to solve a lot of little problems which are not solved in other way. So it's very important. And for the other point, saying that Haftar do not agree to put the military under a civilian elected body, it's not true. I made 2 important interviews with him, and I asked really frankly these questions, and he said, yes, if it is elected, there is no problem. So there is hope, I think.
Well, that's a very good point to leave this debate on, and as a result I'd like to thank my guests for joining us. That of course been Rumiana, Mohammed, Juma and Mattia, and it's now time for Media Watch. And joining me in the studio is Emma James, who's been surfing, that's what I'm trying to say, long day, Emma, the internet. And as we've been discussing, you've been looking at what people have been saying about Libya and the fact that it has domestic issues to address, but it's also become a key figure in Europe's attempts to solve the migrant crisis, and something that, of course, which has become very controversial.
Yes, extremely controversial. The EU has signalled that the Libyan Coast Guard is really key to solving the problem of the migrant crisis in Europe, and they're putting tens of millions of euros into supporting them in order to make their work function better. That's the idea of it. But it is a question for many. Is this really the right course to take? Politico has a particularly interesting article that was posted on the web today, written by Craig Spencer, who is a doctor who works on board a search and rescue ship. So he knows exactly how it functions, very much at the heart of the matter. And what he says is that additional support for the Libyan Coast Guard will only cause more people to drown at Europe's doorstep. It does seem incredible on the face of it, because they are the people who are closest geographically and are there, you would think, to purely serve that role. But Craig Spencer, dismisses them as an organisation whose legitimacy and reliability are as fractious as the country itself. He really is very, very damning, and that is based on what he has seen and what others have reported to him. Now, they do have their successes without question, and this was a story this week on Monday. Almost 300 migrants were rescued by the Libyan Coast Guard, bound for Europe, and that was 2 different operations, so 2 different boatloads of migrants who were saved. But this article also talks about the scale of the problem at hand. They quote the figures of the International Organization for Migration, which says more than 100,000 migrants have attempted to make the journey from Libya to Europe. That's just this year. 85,000 of those are turning up in Italy, which gives you an idea of the scale of the problem they face. 2,360 of those people have drowned. But even with those those numbers in mind, and obviously wanting to limit the number of deaths on the water, there are still many, many controversies about the role of the Libyan Coast Guard. Now, this article in the Washington Post comes from just a couple of weeks ago. And this paints a really vivid and disturbing picture of what is happening on the seas involving the Libyan Coast Guard. They talk in particular about a crowded dinghy, and alongside it is a Coast Guard's boat with a uniformed man who is standing yelling at the migrants, or would-be migrants, holding a bullwhip. Now, he's not just holding it, he then actually uses it to strike a shirtless man on board the boat. Others panicked, fell into the sea, and then were grappling to get back on board. When this journalist showed the video to another member of the Libyan Coast Guard to get his reaction to it, asking if it was normal, he merely shrugged and said, "We have to punish them to make them calm down." So you can understand from that alone why there are problems, but also, as well as these violent tactics, there are also allegations of people trafficking being levelled against the Coast Guard. And this article says that many of them are tied in with the militia and armed groups within Libya, which of course is causing no end of trouble. They are trying to basically profit from the business of people trafficking, from the business of trying to get people across to Europe, which is where they want to head to. And they say in this article that for most, being rescued by the Coast Guard means a forced return to Libya, where they are exposed to more abuse, incarcerated, and even sold again to smugglers. Now, they spoke to one migrant who spoke about the fact that they beat everyone and took everything. It really is a dire, dire situation. The EU thinks that they could be the answer, but many wondering really whether they are the right direction to be turning in.
Extraordinarily sad tales. Thanks for that. That's Emma James with Media Watch, and that's it for this edition. Do stay with us here on France 24 as my colleague Laura Cellier will be back with more news and headlines at the top of the hour.